I noticed you usually.
Okay, cool. We're live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest. His name is John Klyczek. His last name is spelled K-L-Y-C-Z-E-K, and he published a book back in 2019. Full title of the book is School World Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education. I think it's a very important book, and I'm glad he reached out to me. I was reading through a lot of it today, and some nefarious characters kept popping up over and over. And it's kind of shocking to see how much a lot of corporate, very wealthy people are involved in American education. And I think that putting their hands on this is pretty incredible. And I think it's an incredible book. So people check that out. John Klyczek has an MA in English and has taught college rhetoric and research argumentation for over 7 years. His literary scholarship concentrates on the history of global eugenics and Aldous Huxley's dystopic novel, Brave New World. He's a contributor to the Intrepid Report, The Dissident Voice, Op-Ed News, News with Views, and Natural News. He is also the director of writing and editing at Black Freighter Productions Books. In addition, Klyczek holds a black belt in classical Taekwondo, and he is a certified kickboxing instructor under the International Muay Thai Boxing Association. And he has a lot of very personal connections to, I think, very important people. We were chatting in the pre-show, probably a little too long, but he can share that too. So, John Klyczek, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me, William.
Awesome. So for people, I mean, maybe you can add to your background, but just talk about your background, what led you to write this book, and some of the interesting people that you met along the way when you wrote it.
Okay, yeah. So the book sort of started as an article. So I am an educator. I teach at various community colleges. I'm an adjunct, which sometimes they call us freeway flyers because, with Obamacare, they sort of cap how many classes you can teach. So, you're sort of jumping around to whatever college is going to offer you a class for that semester. And because I was an educator or am an educator, I, never really planned to write necessarily about education, kind of wanted to keep a little buffer between, myself and my workspace. But during the time of Bruce Rauner, when he was the governor of Illinois, we went through a budgetary crisis where he was basically stalling on passing the budget. And I saw this as basically a ploy to privatize public services, including public education. And at the same time, I'd noticed that, Rauner was big into charter schools. Actually, there's actually a Rauner College Prep charter school. And when he would do his State of the State addresses, he would push these slogans like Cradle to Career, which is this idea about changing academics to workforce training. There was a big move for something called P20 councils, which are basically institutions that facilitate public-private partnership between education, healthcare, criminal justice agencies. And I had also been working for a private tutoring company at the time that was online, and this particular company was wanting to pilot IBM's Watson, which is their artificial intelligence, to sort of data mine what we were doing in order to develop AI that could sort of tutor on its own. So while I'm sort of watching our funds dry up and my department eventually got shut down, I decided, well, this is probably a good time to maybe write about this or say something. And, everything that I just mentioned, so the changing from academics to workforce training, the school choice movement, which is just a euphemism for privatizing education through public-private partnerships, and then also the ed tech agenda. This was all stuff that I'd heard Charlotte Iserbyt talk about for many years, and it's thoroughly documented in her book, The Deliberate Dumbing Down of America, both the full version and the abridged version. And so, I wrote this first piece. It's called The Corporatization of Education. And I sort of looked into the background on Rauner, his connections to Arne Duncan, who was the Secretary of Education at one point, but he was also the CEO of Chicago Public School Systems.
And these are Republicans and Democrats, right? These are both parties.
Yeah, right. And actually, some of the people that supported Rauner at the time, there was, I always get him mixed up with Cory Brooks. I think it's Cory Booker. And he was a sort of a left-wing guy here. And also Oh, it's escaping my memory right now. But if you read the first chapter of the book, it's in there. But these were a couple other Democrats who supported him, and he gave them some cush positions in the state government as a result. I think one of them was the head of the tollway system in Illinois. And so, upon writing that piece, I focused largely on the corporatization aspect. Didn't really get into the technology stuff quite yet. But Charlotte Iserbyt wrote me an email because I started the first article, which became the first chapter of the book. I wasn't intending to make it a book quite yet. And I got this email from her that said, "Thank you so much." And first I'm thinking, well, this is got to be a virus or a troll or something, but it was her. And we sort of kicked it off. She encouraged me to just keep doing what you're doing, keep writing. And so since I saw these other aspects, including the workforce training, what they also call school to work, and then the whole education technology, or otherwise known as the ed tech agenda, I figured, well, I could make at least a series of articles, and maybe if she can give me a little extra support here, maybe I can turn this thing into a book. So I went down that path, and she, for people that don't know, she was also, her father and grandfather were members of the Order of Skull and Bones, and it just happened to be that at this time, I was picked up. I found in a used bookstore Anthony Sutton's introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones, America's Secret Establishment, and funny enough, I didn't know that she was the one who had leaked him the Skull and Bones address book. So I'm sort of at the same time that I'm deciding to start writing about this, this book sort of fell in my lap, and I'm realizing that there's a Skull and Bones connection here, and so I started to weave into the argument of this whole corporate workforce training ed tech agenda, how the Order of Skull and Bones has been instrumental in pushing all of these various transformations in public education. And so she put me in touch with my publisher, Chris Milligan at Trying Day Books. And Chris Milligan actually is the man who republished Sutton's introduction to the Order of Skull and Bones after it went out of print. And so, I was, my book in many ways is the historical heir, both to Sutton's work and Iserbyt's, not just in terms of the content and the research, but I ended up spending during COVID, the lockdowns, I took my online teaching with me, and I spent a lot of time with Charlotte. I probably made 6 trips up to Maine, and one of them I spent a whole month there, and helped out around the house and stuff. She recently passed away this year. And over the course of my visits, one of the things that I helped out with was she had a big barn, and I helped clean out this barn. And in the barn was about 13 cabinets, 34 different drawers, legal size files. Took me 100 hours, so 10-hour days to dig everything out. And by dig everything out, I didn't just grab it. I went through, because a lot of the stuff was sort of duplicated. Her filing system was such that they were like citations. So she would have one document in multiple files to sort of illustrate how these different documents were connected. But she let me take all this stuff home, and you can actually access these files on my database, which I update every week, every Thursday. And before she passed, she ended up giving me basically all the books she had, and it's about 1,000 books. Including the address book. So I have the physical copies of the address books, and you can actually see those at my database.
Right. So she leaked the 1925 address and names of the Skull and Bones members, right?
Yeah, there's 3 address books that she had. So one is 1977, and then there's, actually it's 2, because the 2 out of the 3 are actually, they broke the catalogs into living members and deceased members. So that one, I believe, is 1983. So technically it's 2 catalogs, just one of them is separated. It's bound into 2 separate copies. Yeah. And so that they're giving you the membership list starting, 1832 all the way to 1983 in the older version. Wow. Or the newer version. Yeah, and right. I might add too, I also went up and visited with my publisher, Chris Milligan, last summer. And he had a small filing cabinet with a lot of Sutton's research. His the report on the abuse of power, which was a newsletter he had. I scanned pretty much all of those, and various other files that he had on technology. His background was actually in engineering. He was a production engineer. Yeah, I always thought of him as a either a historian or an economist or a historian of economics. And actually, no, he was a production engineer. And Chris actually has his dissertation, which I got to sort of take a look at. It was, very impressive to see the type of work that went into it, especially during, I think he published his dissertation in the 1960s. This is before digital computers,
Right.
And so like he had all these graphs and charts that, you make bar graphs out of little ticker tape and stuff, so just the meticulous nature of his research. But so what he focused a lot on was not just the history. He focused on the history of the Order of Skull and Bones because for people that don't know, he worked for the Hoover Institute at Stanford, and he wrote a series. It's Western Technology and Soviet Economic Development. There's 3 volumes to it. And basically what he uncovered was that the United States was instrumental in financing the Soviet Union during a time throughout the Cold War when effectively they would not have become the formidable opponents that they became had they not had the economic aid of a lot of the Wall Street bigwigs.
Wall Street and the Russian Revolution is the name of that book, yeah.
Oh yeah, that's another one. That's what he did later on. But the 3-volume series, I've got 2 out of the 3. The 3rd volume, if you want to get it, you can find a used copy. The cheapest you're going to find, I think, is either $700 or over $1,000. And that's the one that he went and published on his own because the people at the Hoover Institute, what they said was, the quote is, "Anthony, don't break your rice bowl," meaning don't. If you publish this, right, this is taboo for academia, and you're going to basically ruin your academic career.
And the Hoover Institution is a very legit scholarly institute. I think they had like one of the former prime ministers of Russia ended up there. Like they will take people from all over the world. So just the fact that Sutton was able to be associated with the Hoover Institution is something. He was a very legitimate scholar, even though he wrote on topics that people like, it's kind of hidden history or it's hidden away history.
Yeah, and he sort of made that decision to kind of go into like crypto politics because of what happened as a result of his decision to republish to publish that 3rd volume. Basically, his investigation was sort of to figure out who did I upset, right? Like who are the people behind the curtain that are telling the people who hired me to write this book that I shouldn't be able to publish it. And when he finally got his hands on the address books that Charlotte leaked to him, he said it clicked for him because a lot of the financiers that he came across in his research in that 3-volume series were members of the Order of Skull and Bones. And so he sort of has this aha moment. And as you mentioned, right, then he goes on to write Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. I have a copy of that as well. And then he also has Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, because what he also discovered was that they also financed the Nazi regime particularly through Union Banking Corporation and 3 bonesmen by the name of Prescott Bush, who's the father of George H.W. and the grandfather of George W. Also along that helped out with that was E. Roland Harriman. He's a bonesman, and then another bonesman named Knight Woolley. And in particular, through Union Banking Corporation, they were financing, funneling money through Fritz Tyson, who was part of the Nazi Party. And so basically what Sutton sort of surmised from this was that also knowing the history of Skull and Bones, tracing its philosophical roots back to Georg Hegel, they were deeply steeped in Hegelianism. And the crux of Hegelian philosophy is the Hegelian dialectic, which is thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So basically, through history evolves through these opposing ideas, okay? And through these opposing ideas, eventually comes the conflict. You create a synthesis, right? Some middle ground. And this is actually where we get the term evolution. That's Hegel's term. It's not actually Darwin. Darwin was basically just a biological Hegelian. Marx was a materialist or an economic Hegelian. And I know you're a lawyer. Actually, modern case law is basically Hegelian, right? So instead of having the principles rooted in natural law, it's the dialectic of the various case laws that evolve and determine what should be our public code. And so basically what Sutton sort of surmised from their financing of both sides of World War II, financing both communism and fascism, was that by financing both sides, you could sort of steer the conflict, you could hedge your bets on either side, and then out of it, you would get a more unified global order. And obviously, at the end of World War II, we get the United Nations and very other what we could call global governance institutions.
Right, UNESCO, which you mentioned in this book too. But the Bonesman ideology has been influencing education from very, very early. Actually, and the law too. You actually mentioned the guy who came up with the corporation. I forgot his name.
I think its last name is Waite.
Waite. Yeah. A lot of people don't know that guy was a bonesman. Like, he created the whole corporate infrastructure of the United States.
Right. You have him to thank for the idea that corporations are people, right? Yeah. And actually, Sutton, the first chapter of his book, America's Secret Establishment, the first chapter is how the order controls education. And he told Charlotte that he thought that was the most important out of all of the chapters. They were originally memorandums. So he wrote these memorandums and he published them separately. I actually have one of the original memorandums right here. But then he sort of wove them together into the tapestry of his book. And what he discovered was that through various bonesmen, they set up the compulsory education system through, in particular, Alphonso Taft, and he actually helped establish the Order of Skull and Bones with William Huntington Russell. And at Antioch College, it was with the help of Alphonso Taft that Horace Mann gets promoted, and he basically becomes the founding father of compulsory public education in the United States. Later on, you get the importation of Hegelian philosophy through bonesmen like Daniel Coit Gilman, Andrew Dixon White, and Timothy Dwight, who are known as the Troika. But what they also did was they tied Hegelian philosophy with Wundtian stimulus response psychology. So Wilhelm Wundt, he created modern psychology as a laboratory science. So prior to this, it was basically a subdiscipline of philosophy. And at Leipzig University in Germany, Wilhelm Wundt basically comes up with this idea that all learning happens through what he calls the stimulus response method. And so that means that all learning is basically a behavioral or a cognitive behavioral response to environmental stimuli. And this is effectively the basis for what becomes known as classical conditioning. The best known example is like Pavlov's dog. Okay. Early on, it was purely associative, right? So the idea of just getting the mind or the behaviors to associate certain stimuli with certain outcomes. So, you can take a natural stimulus, as in the instance of Pavlov's dog. You take food, as a natural stimulus, the natural response is to salivate. If you associate the natural stimulus with an artificial stimulus, such as a bell, then you can associate the food with the bell. And by extension, you can associate the salivation with the bell. Eventually, you can remove the food and you can condition the dog to salivate just at the sound of the bell. So over a series of, developments in psychology, you go from classical conditioning to what's known as behaviorism. So basically, they just start to look at punishment and reward cycles and how to use punishment and rewards to create routines that would help to refine the associative stimulus response conditioning. And then eventually you get down to operant conditioning. And operant conditioning, the idea here is, so B.F. Skinner is the founding father of operant conditioning, basically just adds 4 quadrants, or technically adds 2 quadrants to the punishment and reward And so you have positive and negative punishment, positive, negative reward. The positive and negative just refers to, are you adding a stimulus or are you removing a stimulus in order to elicit the particular response? But he wanted to see how you could elicit the responses in an operative form, meaning you want the response to be the performance of a particular behavior. And so he liked to, have pigeons and cats and things, sort of, so the pigeon would peck at a button in association with a light, and right, to get food. And so it could only get the food when the light was on, right? So he had to learn that he couldn't just peck this thing at any time, but if he pecked it when the light was on, he would get a food. And basically that becomes the modern teaching machine. Now I should mention here that the development of stimulus response conditioning into behaviorism into operant conditioning is heavily financed by the Rockefeller General Education Board. Okay, and this was the first philanthropy of the Rockefeller family. And actually,
you have to put philanthropy in quotes. Whenever it's Gates or Rockefeller, there might be some other hidden sinister motives too, I would say.
Yeah,
you're right. No, it's philanthropy.
Yeah, no, I mean, a better term is just tax exempt corporation, right? I mean, because at one level it's basically just to, first of all, you get to take a bunch of your profit and put it into a trust that's not taxable, okay? And then at the same time, though, you can use that tax exempt foundation to basically engineer society to reinforce the markets you're already dominating. So effectively, right, you're taking this tax-free money and you're leveraging it to basically increase your effective monopoly over the economy, right?
Over all parts of the economy, even into education, which is really terrifying.
Yeah. And so one of the board members of the General Education Board was, in fact, Daniel Coit Gilman. And we should also mention that the Rockefeller family is itself a Skull and Bones family. The Percy Rockefeller was a member of Skull and Bones. Okay, and if we move down history a little bit, some of that GEB money and other Rockefeller philanthropies, they would go to Columbia University, and that's where E.L. Thorndike was there, and he sort of piggybacked on John B. Watson's ideas about behaviorism. John B. Watson was the guy that did the little Albert experiments. He's one of the first people to apply the behavioral conditioning to humans. And basically what he wanted to figure out was, could you condition this child to be scared of rabbits? Okay. And so they would take this rabbit out and they'd put it in front of this little Albert baby. And then they would make a really loud noise. They would bang a hammer or something to startle the child. And eventually he associated that startling noise with the rabbit. So eventually you could bring the rabbit out and you would be scared of the rabbit. And the conditioning was so deep that eventually anything that was white and furry, he would be scared of. And you could even just put on a rabbit mask and you would be scared of it. Okay. And this is sort of the beginning of moving from just conditioning animals to conditioning people. So E.L. Thorndike, is in the school of behaviorism, and he comes up with what are called puzzle box experiments. And this is just, the beginnings of, sort of putting the rat in a maze and seeing how you can condition the behavior. B.F. Skinner takes off with it, and he moves from what he calls the puzzle box experiments to what he calls his Skinner box experiments. And the Skinner box eventually becomes the modern teaching machine. Okay. And so there's a book, it's The Technology of Teaching. It's 1960-ish. And it was financed by Dean of Harvard Graduate School at the time, Bonesman McGeorge Bundy. Okay. Wow. In fact, McGeorge Bundy, he was also president of the Ford Foundation, which was also involved in the financing of The Technology of Teaching, that book by B.F. Skinner. And while McGeorge Bundy was the president at the Ford Foundation, the vice president of the Ford Foundation was actually another Bonesman by the name of Harold Howe II. And Harold Howe II was himself a commissioner of education, I want to say either late 50s, early 60s. Okay. And so in The Technology of Teaching, it's not just B.F. Skinner's theories on how to create what is known as programmed learning or programmed instruction, but he actually had prototypes of the early teaching machines. And if you go to Smithsonian website, you can see some early pictures of the teaching machines. And Early on, they were all analog, okay, and they were basically like, I use the analogy of like the old Viewmasters. If you're young enough to remember, the Viewmasters was these goggles that when you were a kid, they had like Disney pictures, and there's a wheel with all the pictures, and you have this gear and it moves it. Okay. In the teaching machine, you sort of have that card, and there's two slots, and one of it has the learning stimuli, which is going to be, there it is. That's good. That's a good version of it. So it's going to be question, answer, multiple choice, matching, short response, etc. And then the other slot is where you're going to scribe your answer. And then you can only turn it one way. You can't go backwards. And then the first turn on it is going to give you the answer right away. So it's automated in the sense that it gives you an immediate response. You don't have to do your homework, turn it into the teacher, wait for the teacher to grade it, and respond. And eventually, when you get to the end there, it's going to total up your score. And, and then the teacher might, decide, are you ready? If you do really well and you do it really fast, the teacher might put a more advanced card in there. If you don't do so well, you take too long, they might remediate you. They might give you a similar card with different questions, but same level of difficulty, same concepts. Okay. And this is also what becomes known as individualized or personalized instruction, because the student can take his or her own time and he gets an automated response. And therefore, it's theoretically more efficient than one teacher trying to go across 30 different students and give them all equal attention, which obviously, right, is impossible. You can't be interacting with each student one-on-one at the same time. So eventually, they move on to the IBM punch card system, and then, moving into early electronics. And then, there's actually a document that Charlotte gave me. It's called Teaching Machines and Programmed Learning, or Teaching Machines and Programmed Instruction. I always mix it up. It's on my website.
And this punch card isn't much different than like the modern Scantron, is it?
No, not at all. It's just instead of filling in with the lead, they'd have you punch a hole in it, and then as you feed it through the machine, when the light goes through the hole, that sets off a sensor, and then basically it reads that. So it's effectively the same concept. It's just one's filling it in with number 2 pencil lead, and the other one has a hole in it, right? And so eventually here, the teaching machines get financed by Department of the Army, Department of the Navy, Department of the Air Force, and some of the early iterations of those teaching machines were developed by IBM. Okay, and IBM later goes on to develop, as I mentioned, Watson's artificial intelligence, Watson AI. Now it's worth noting here that Watson is named after Thomas J. Watson. Thomas J. Watson was the head of IBM at a time when, during World War II, they were doing business with Hitler, and they were sending over the punch card system to process the concentration camp data. And what a lot of people don't know is that it's not that data wasn't just to sort of keep a census of who came in and out, and how long you worked them for until they euthanized them or whatever. But they also did eugenic experiments on the people. Okay, and so
Thomas Watson is a notorious eugenicist. He was a total racist. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah. And interestingly enough, so one of the PhDs under Wilhelm Wundt was a guy by the name of James McKean Cattell. And James McKean Cattell was the guy that hired E.L. Thorndike. And James McKean Cattell, he wanted to combine Wundtian stimulus response psychology with Galton's theories about biological inheritance. So this is where you get into biopsychology. And so it's sort of the merger. A lot of times people think of, historically in academia, biological sciences and psychological sciences have sort of been separated, right? And so you think of them as nature versus nurture as usually the paradigm, or historically been the paradigm. But moving into the realm of modern neurology and the development of what are brain-computer interfaces, you're merging the biological and the psychological conditioning. And so actually, there's two to sort of illustrate that. I mean, this was always sort of the case with eugenics, is that you had what Hitler called race hygiene. Okay, and so he was very focused on, he wanted his eugenic sterilization, euthanasia campaigns to be focused on your ethnic heritage, right? So were you Jewish, or were you black or brown, etc. And that sort of determined whether or not you were so-called unfit. But then there was another sort of offshoot that was known as mental hygiene. And so whether or not, it didn't matter what your ethnic heritage was, if you had an IQ score that wasn't high enough, that could put you on the slate for forced sterilization. And this was rampant across the United States. Actually, a lot of people don't know the world's first compulsory sterilization law was in Indiana. I want to say 1907 or 1904. I think it's 1907. Okay, and so when you hear terms like idiot, imbecile, moron, those were actually like so-called scientific terms that referred to specific scores on your IQ test, right? And so each one was a standard deviation below the average mean of 100. So if you're 90, 80, 70, etc., right, that would be idiot, imbecile, moron, etc. Okay, and so basically this later becomes what becomes known. There's a burgeoning field called precision education, and so it sort of comes out of the history of Charles Murray's bell curve. And so if you've ever taken a look at that, and you just look at if you've done your research on the history of sort of IQ science, the Simons-Binet IQ tests, and you look at like which ethnic groups did they correlate these particular IQ scores with statistically, like they're pretty much identical to what Charles Murray pushes. And if you look at his just look at his endnotes, there's big chunks where you can see the bulk of his citations come from people who were avid eugenicists, either crypto eugenicists or explicitly eugenicists, right? And so some of these would be Arthur Jensen, Richard Lynn, Felipe J. Rushton, William Shockley, Linda Gottfredson. And these people a lot of them were affiliated with something called the Pioneer Fund, which was basically like a white supremacist think tank. Okay. And they did actually emphasize the ethnic correlations to what they would call the mental hygiene IQ scores. But they did,
sorry to interrupt, but there was an academic who took those guys apart. I can't remember his name offhand, but he went after Shockley. And there was one other guy too. I don't know if you mentioned his name, but there was another guy, a pre-Murray person, but I can't remember the name of that academic. But yeah,
I'm thinking one of the books from one of those guys, and the author escapes me as well, might be Not in Our Genes, and I think Stephen Jay Gould might be one of them as well. Yeah, I think he took issue with that. But moving forward today, there's sort of a push to kind of sort of bring it back. And, it's interesting to note here that Charles Murray is a Bilderberg Group member. Okay. He's been at the Bilderberg meetings, and he's also a big pusher for online learning, and specifically online learning for people that he says genetically, in terms of their genetic IQ scores, are not fit for higher learning academia, to be sort of, taught or trained, or I guess conditioned, for roles of, entrepreneurship or, government, policy making, etc. And so this new movement is called precision education. And it's actually one of the main proponents of it is a guy by the name of Robert Plowman, who is also cited in Charles Murray's bell curve. Okay. And this guy, Robert Plowman, actually he says he wants to have, quote, a learning chip that sort of keeps records of your genetic IQ propensity. Now, when he says learning chip, I don't think it's basically like a brain computer interface like Elon Musk Neuralink or what else is being developed at Facebook. But it sounds like it's just going to be some sort of a digital ID that sort of keeps track of your genetic IQ propensity. And then that's going to track you that's going to determine which modules you can use on your online learning. So those teaching machines that I mentioned, those analog teaching machines, eventually they get developed into something called adaptive learning courseware. And some of the products for adaptive learning courseware there's Dreambox, Brightspace Leap, Newton, Smart Sparrow, Clever. Okay, both Clever and Newton are funded by Peter Thiel, who is also a member of the Bilderberg Group. He was also a speechwriter for Bill Bennett, who was the Secretary of Education under Ronald Reagan. He actually took over from T.H. Bell, who was the Secretary of Education, when Charlotte Iserbyt worked in the Department of Education at a time when she leaked something called Project BEST, and that's basic education skills through technology. And I have the full copy. It's on my website at the database. And what that shows was basically the beginnings of everything that I've sort of laid out. So it was to set up public-private partnerships with education technology corporations in order to replace academics with workforce training that would be implemented through operant conditioning algorithms through the Skinner box teaching machines. Okay. And so basically Bennett picks up the mantle of that program. He ends up setting up a virtual charter school corporation known as K-12 Inc. It's actually one of the largest in the country. I believe it was the very first virtual charter school. And this was the place where the modern adaptive learning courseware was first piloted. It was on these online virtual charter schools. Okay. And not only is the adaptive learning courseware, if you look at Dreambox, if you go on Dreambox's website, they explicitly trace it back to the Skinner box teaching machine. But they also say that the algorithms that they use to, as we said, personalize or individualize your learning, they are basically identical to the behavioral advertising algorithms that are used for like Netflix, right? And others, this similar algorithms on social media. So anytime you get a personalized ad, it's that same sort of algorithm that's used in the adaptive learning course, where it's just, instead of looking at what you want to purchase, it's looking at how effectively and efficiently do you respond to the learning stimulus on the teaching machines, or on the adaptive learning courseware. And so, to tie in this idea about precision education, basically what that would do is sort of cap you, in advance of actually getting on the courseware, the module. So in other words, if your IQ score is, yay high, right? It's low, it's too low. They're not even going to bother with having that thing, programmed for what they call career pathways. So depending on how you respond to the learning stimuli, right, it's going to track you either into a career pathway, or right, if you do well enough, maybe it'll put you in advanced placement, and maybe you can go on to higher learning and get some scholarships and stuff, right? But if your IQ score starts off low enough, right, we're just gonna cap you at the career pathways in advance, and then that algorithm is sort of going to be limited accordingly. And so through both the precision ed and basically the stimulus response operating conditioning method, you have sort of a merger or a synthesis of the biological engineering and the psychological engineering through the modern online learning systems.
It's crazy to think like that's where we're at. All these things, and these charter schools have taken off, right? But it goes all the way through, and DeVos was a huge thing. I forgot that it was Pence that actually decided that deciding vote to actually get her to become in the Department of Education. Like, she's like a total fox in the henhouse, man.
Oh yeah. She's
or was, I should say.
Yeah. She was heavily invested in charter schools. Okay. In particular, she was invested in K-12 Inc. Okay, and she actually, I had a FOIA request that shows on one of her tours across the country as Secretary of Ed, she met privately with Peter Thiel. Now, we don't know what they talked about because, the itinerary just says they met. I think it was either at his home or her home. I believe it was at his home. But I would imagine that, right, given the nature of her role as Secretary of Ed and given his interest in his financing of adaptive learning courseware and also his history of writing speeches for Bill Bennett, that they probably talked about some way to, further the whole adaptive learning agenda. Okay. But another thing that she's invested in was actually on the board of was a company called NeuroCore. Okay. And so this is where we get into another iteration of EdTech, and that is it's called social emotional learning. And largely what is used to track social emotional learning algorithms are what they call biofeedback wearables. Okay, so the adaptive learning courseware is going to data mine what's known as cognitive behavioral algorithms. In other words, thinking algorithms. Okay, and the social emotional learning algorithms are going to basically be data mining students' feeling algorithms. So now you're going to have a permanent sort of psychological profile on each student in terms of what they think, how they behave, and how do they feel. Okay, and NeuroCore had
Oh, that's like a hellscape. Like, oh my God. Like, can
yeah,
you imagine the abuse of that data? I'm sure that they present it as always for the best of you, but if somebody back ends that or gets that data, it's incredible. Like they could
I mean, so
tinker with anybody. Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, one of the sort of the pitches for this is one of the early pitches, and now that it's at least the adaptive learning courseware is pretty. I don't want to say it's ubiquitous, but it's very common, right? The biofeedback wearables, not so much. They're sort of being pitched still, but sort of the early pitches for these technologies was basically how they would help students with learning disabilities, right, or students with like test anxiety, emotional difficulties, mental health issues, etc. Right. So, and same thing with brain computer interfaces, right? Elon Musk Neuralink. The pitch for these is that they'll help people that have Parkinson's syndrome, are paralyzed, have epilepsy. Okay, and then once it sort of gets normalized as this sort of what they call an assistive technology, then eventually, right, it's like, well, hey, I mean, why don't you use one too? It wouldn't hurt to, get some of your algorithms in here. We might be able to refine our lessons for you a little bit. But DeVos's NeuroCore, and by the way, the links, the website, they changed the URL. So the old URL for NeuroCore doesn't work anymore. And so I don't know if they, I dug around and tried to find the new address. I don't know where that company's at in the mix right now, but recently I clicked on some of those links and they didn't work. By the way, all the citations in the book, there's over 1,000 of them. It's 100 pages of citations. I have everyone that's online through a link that's still up. You can get on my website under my resources page under the bibliography page. But what NeuroCore is it's an EEG headband. Okay, so it's going to monitor and data mine the students' brain waves, basically. Okay, and based on the students' brain waves, they can infer their emotional, psychological state, right? And so basically, does the student like the curriculum? Is he or she enjoying it? Is he or she confused? Are the students frustrated? Are they daydreaming? And based on that, right, theoretically, you would tailor or refine the lessons accordingly. So that's one realm of the social emotional learning, although the acronym is CELL, the cell biofeedback wearables. But they have a whole array. So they also have heart monitors through like a company called HeartMath, which basically infers the same mental or emotional metrics, but just using a different biofeedback algorithm. So looking at how the students' heart rate correlates with their brain waves. And then they also have galvanic skin response monitors. And there's companies the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation financed those. There's a company called Effectiva that has financed those as well. And those basically data mine the students' skin conductivity. And basically the skin conductivity can give you a window into the other two metrics in terms of the intensity of the emotions that you can infer from the EEGs and the ECGs.
It's just incredible. Like, just imagine like the capacity of Neuralink or NeuroCore to get that information from people. It's like 23andMe. Like, they imagine the data that they've compiled willingly from these people. Like, oh, you want to just do it? It's for my benefit to get this information. They could select all kinds of people. They could find, dupes. It's like a farming operation for different characters and personalities and things like that. Like, that's terrifying, super terrifying. And like, people need to disabuse themselves of like Trump MAGA, because DeVos is in there. So is Mnuchin. You talk about Mnuchin, like a bonesman is still tinkering around, right?
Yeah. And one of the ways that I saw him as instrumental in the and sort of the the furthering of this whole ed tech AI agenda is that there was when they did the Trump Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a lot of people referred to it as the Tax Cuts and Robots Act, because there's I think it's called the full and immediate expensing clause in there. Okay. And basically what that enabled was, so typically if you're a company and you buy some new equipment, as it depreciates over time, you can write off the depreciation, right, over time in increments, right? But with the full and immediate expensing clause, you could buy a new some new equipment, okay, some new technology, and at the end of the very first year that you bought it, you could write off all the depreciation. So you could basically get it for free, right? You could basically get, all, if not most of your money back on it. Okay. And obviously, what is going to be the most efficient use of new equipment in the 21st century? It's going to be stuff that automates your workforce, or in the case of schools, automates teaching, automates instruction, automates learning. And actually, during COVID, there was it was the distance learning and innovation rules. I think it's FR 18638, I believe. That should be the correct code, but you can find the article on my website. Okay, it's like COVID-19 CARES Act bankrolls AI in schools. Okay,
Tell me your website URL.
Oh, it's schoolworldorder.info. Okay, and basically what that did was it sort of links up with this full immediate expensing clause, or at least it adds extra incentive to sort of automate instruction, because before these new regulations, so when you get credit at a school, it needs to be what they call accredited at the state and then federal level, and at the college system in particular, right? If you want to transfer, okay, it has to meet these accreditation standards. Okay, and one of the things that you had to do to qualify this course credit is accredited was there had to be a certain amount of interaction between the teacher and the student, right, human to human. But the distance learning and innovation rules, what they basically allowed was they sort of redefined what that interaction was, and they opened it up for they said, quote, adaptive learning. They used exactly the adaptive learning language, and they literally refer to adaptive learning as, quote, artificial intelligence. And basically what they're saying is that student interaction with an AI algorithm is on par with or can substitute human to human or teacher to student interaction, which, right, gives you incentive to buy a bunch of ed tech stuff with your CARES money nonetheless, because they gave out tons of CARES money, and a lot of it had to be used for either for PPE or at the school level, for technologies that could facilitate distance learning during lockdown. And so, right, you take that money and you can go ahead and write it straight off. Yeah. And I might mention, you sort of surmise a little bit about like the implications of all this data. Well, there's a similar EEG headband used for learning in China. It's called the Focus One headband. Okay, and it's in my book. If you want to see a creepy visual illustration of it, there's a video. It's on YouTube. So if you were to put in a search engine, Wall Street Journal, China brain code, okay, it's like maybe 8 minutes. And if you just watch like the first 3-4 minutes, you'll see these kids with these Focus One headbands on, and you'll also see not just how all the students are having their brainwaves data mined.
Oh,
there it
wow,
is, right
there it
there in
is.
the middle, right? Not only will you see, but you'll also see that the data goes to a dashboard at the teacher's desk. But then it'll pan out and it'll show you how that data links up to the broader social credit system that is used to determine the students' entire lives, their access to the public square, commercial services, everything from healthcare, jobs, education, housing, transportation, even due process, because you can be put on a blacklist, right, if you have wrong think, okay, or you behave inappropriately, right? And this stuff links up with, as you see there, all the facial recognition cameras. So it's not just data mining what you're doing online, what you're doing with your ed tech, but it also data mines like, or did you jaywalk? Like, what are you doing in physical public space, right? Because that social credit score is linked to your biometrics. You'll see there, they're interacting with robots, right? And so another thing that my book looks at is how that was one of those social emotional facial recognition algorithms. Is that a lot of this data is being used to also engineer artificial intelligence, and by that I not just more sophisticated adaptive learning courseware and biofeedback algorithms, but because those are all effectively limited versions of AI. But as you've seen there, that sort of humanoid looking thing, right? They want to use basically the thinking algorithms and the feeling algorithms to engineer what they call artificial general intelligence, or AGI, which is basically AI that can mimic a human, right? So basically humanoid AI that can interact with a human being and sort of not just identify and respond to human emotions, but to sort of exhibit them, right? Now I don't believe that means that the robot feels. It just means that it recognizes the patterns and associates it with various categories of emotion, and then can therefore with its humanoid sort of exoskeleton elicit maybe a smile or a confused look or something. But and that's just to sort of more effectively interact with and condition the human. It's not, I don't believe that it actually is going to be conscious or have emotions in anything like we understand a human being to have those things.
Right. I mean, it's just so creepy. It becomes like you're watching Star Trek or something like that. Like, this is off the charts. Like, why would you even want this? How would you not want? I mean, human being teachers can actually tailor their teaching to each person more than they're just taking the person out of it. The human, it's like a cold, sterile view of human beings as human resources, and it comes from these elites like Skull and Bones, and these guys are just like, oh, we're going to get ready for the workforce. You use that term like birth to tomb, or what is it? Womb to tomb. Like we've got you figured out all the way to, and that's really what's even more scary is that the public education system is being tailored for the corporation's benefit. So you're going to get the training that they want. You're actually not going to get an education. You're going to get training to be put in and work at Google or Microsoft or one of these tech companies, just like a robot.
Yeah. And you sort of put the idea out there. It's like, well, sort of like, what is the end game? Like what, like how, like this is, it's, we're at the very least, we're going to be losing something about our humanity during the course of this whole, ed tech enterprise, right? I mean, whatever benefits they purport we might get from it, right? I mean, I don't think it's a far stretch to suggest that, what we know as the human condition is going to be radically different in a way that, right, we're going to lose our humanity. Well, I mean, there's a couple terms that I use in the book, and ultimately this, I believe, logically has to be the end game, and that is the engineering of, not just the engineering of AI to have robots and a social credit system, but eventually for what's known as transhumanist or post-human engineering, right? Because eventually, and this is sort of what got me down the rabbit hole, okay? Because as I'm working with that IBM Watson, and I don't anymore because for reasons I'll express, but as I'm sort of working here, I'm thinking like, well, wait a minute, like this thing is data mining what I do, and so every day that I go to work, this thing's getting smarter and it's getting more efficient, more effective. Eventually, right? The idea here is that it's going to be able to do what I do. In other words, it's going to replace me. Okay. And then so I start thinking, well, a lot of times we think of like AI replacing the human workforce, and we usually think of like factory robots, like, oh, they're just going to do like heavy lifting and stuff that nobody wants to do anyways. Except that when in the realm of education, the algorithms are evolving and being engineered to not just replace physical labor, but intellectual labor. So if the AI can replace intellectual labor at a level where it can teach better than a human instructor, what's the point in teaching or learning at all, right? In other words, why use that AI now that it's smart enough to replace the teacher? Why use it to teach the student? Because it might as well just teach another robot. In other words, right? It's good. It will make not just human labor, but human thought, human consciousness obsolete. So at this point, you have no other choice but to do what Elon Musk says, and he literally says, if you can't beat him, join him, right? When he talks about his neural link, right? And he says, well, we're basically already cyborgs because, right, we never go anywhere without our phones, and half our lives is mediated through the phone, and the phone is too slow, right? He calls it a bandwidth problem. So basically, instead of having to use your thumbs and type and have all these apps, right, you sort of evolve from having the ubiquitous mobile devices to eventually having the wearables that I just described, and then eventually have the implantables like the Neuralink. And then at that point, you, according to him, you merge with artificial intelligence. And a lot of the people that are pushing this artificial intelligence evolution, people like Ray Kurzweil, they literally use language like they believe we'll become our own gods. Now, I really think they mean more that they'll become gods and we'll sort of be, part of this peripheral hive mind.
Right. Who's controlling the technology, right? Like, okay, I got this Neuralink from Elon Musk, great, but who's running the show back at headquarters?
Right, right.
And they all say it's all benign. Like, are you sure? Because I've looked at technology in history, and anytime there's technology, it's been used for both sometimes good and sometimes nefarious purposes. I mean, come on.
Yeah, and this actually gets into, sort of gets us back in some ways to Skull and Bones in terms of the occult dimensions of all of this, right? And that is that, so in the Gnostic narrative, they sort of invert the Genesis story, right? So basically, God Jehovah is the villain, and the serpent Lucifer is the hero, right? The God was he was a jealous God, and he imprisoned Adam and Eve in the garden, right? And it was the serpent who came up and freed them from the prison with the fruit of the tree of knowledge, which, right, technology is the apex expression of, right, the pinnacle of human knowledge, right? It is what is manifest from our deepest.
The occultists always say it's the tree of knowledge. It's not just the tree of knowledge; it's the
tree of knowledge of good and evil. Correct.
Right, but they always invert that. They leave out that extra phrase. That's correct. Their view. So,
yeah, correct. And you see this sort of in in a lot of the computer iconography, right? You see the Apple symbol, right? For Apple computers, right? You see Kurzweil himself says we'll be like gods. You've got who's this guy here? Yuval Noah Harari, Homo Deus, right? Which is basically means man god or God man. Google, both Sergey Brin and Larry Page had said they want Google to be the mind of God. And then various other computers often use sort of is it who's the guy? Ben Goertzel, right? His Hanson Robotics, right? His robot is Sophia, right? And that's the goddess of wisdom. I believe that's also a goddess in the Gnostic paradigm.
He's funded by Epstein. I wouldn't worry about it. Yeah, I'm sure.
Right. And so what's interesting is that, so when people talk about becoming their own gods, it's understanding the Gnostic roots, it's Luciferian, right? Ultimately, Luciferian, right? Yeah. And because of that, right, it's another reason I don't think I'm out of my I don't think I'm speculating too much to suggest that they think they'll be gods and that we'll be like in the external hive mind.
Right. It's an issue of human sovereignty and the human condition. Like you're adjusting what human beings were, and is it positive or negative, and how much independence are you really going to have? We've lost tons of independence. I mean, I haven't done anything, but there's databases with all of my knowledge, information that I never assented to. Somebody, in the government can pull up everything that I've ever done in my past. I don't need, it's like, was it some kind of Philip K. Dick book or something like that? We're there, so it's only going to get worse. In a communist system, the people aren't as sovereign. There's not that individualism; it's collectivism, and that strain is around today in the U.S. And sadly, I don't know why these people think that that's some kind of ideal. It is.
Yeah, I mean, and it goes back to the whole Hegelian thing, right? Because I mean, that's at its core, Marx is Hegelian, and Hegel was his was collective, right? He literally said that the state is God marching on earth. Right? And the state is for him the synthesis of in the Marxist paradigm, the state is the synthesis of eventually sort of the bourgeois and the proletariat, through the clash that there comes what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat, and that's
eventually that was its end, right? It was determined that that's the way it was going to end. Like that was their what do you call it, paradise. That was their Eden, really. Communism was going to take over the whole world because that was just the most scientifically logical event. So, and that didn't happen. I mean, there's variations of communism, but it's. I mean, this book is important because we're entering a new phase of human existence that's never existed before. With the advent, as Moore's law keeps geometrically getting more and more dominant computing, it's just people are going to be making all kinds of decisions. John, do you have time for a few questions? I think some people had a couple questions. Dr. Piper, is that all right? Dr. Piper asked, "What do you think about Musk's proposed Neuralink?" I mean, we kind of discussed that.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can expand on it like this. I mean, I guess I sort of went into what I think about Neuralink in particular. But I'll talk about what I think of Musk a little more broadly, especially recently, and that is, I think he's sort of being promoted as like the foil to Bill Gates and who's the Amazon guy, Bezos, right? I mean, those guys, most people sort of think of them as like super villains, right? And like Musk is like the cool billionaire, and he's for free speech, and I think he made a tweet recently that he wants more people instead of less, and but in the meantime, right, he's going to engineer a Neuralink that's basically going to interface you with all this AI. So, I don't think there's anything good about it. I will say, I had a friend, he passed away, not too long before my book was published, and he struggled with epilepsy. Okay. And so, I mean, if he was alive today and said, "Hey, John, I'm going to get the Neuralink to regulate my seizures," which, by the way, they already have some of those types of neural implants that can regulate your epileptic seizures. I mean, I don't think anybody would argue that somebody who has epilepsy shouldn't be allowed to do that. But as far as using it for something other than entirely therapeutic purposes voluntarily, I don't see anything good coming of that. It can only further everything we've talked about during this podcast.
Right. And let's see, any other questions? Anybody? I guess somebody asked you about Huawei. I guess Huawei.
Huawei.
Yeah, Huawei.
Chinese tech company. Yeah. I call it Huawei. Maybe it's Huawei. I always thought it's Huawei.
I don't know. You're probably right. I don't know how to pronounce it. Huawei's. I think they're trying to just get inroads into the United States.
Yeah. So Huawei is, I don't see it as much different as any other big tech companies in the West. I mean, one of the things I could note is, so Huawei obviously is intimately involved in the infrastructure for the social credit system in China. But one thing that's interesting about the social credit system in China is that, okay, it's run by Ant Financial, which is an affiliate or a subsidiary of Alipay, and Alipay is part of Alibaba Group. Alibaba Group is funded by Salesforce, okay, which is Mark Benioff, who's a trustee at the World Economic Forum, and it's also financed by BlackRock. And the Focus One headband that I mentioned, it's engineered by a Chinese electronics company, but it's also was developed through a partnership with academics out of Harvard. And so what I'm pointing out here is that basically all of the Chinese big tech infrastructure and all their big tech corporations, right, they are financed by Western oligarchs and are in partnership with them as well. And I've recently written a few articles that sort of expand. I'm continuing my research on this book, so I write articles all the time. It's sort of expanding what builds on the book. And I looked at some of the UNESCO partnerships that popped up in the wake of COVID. and one of them is the UNESCO Global Education Coalition. And in this Global Education Coalition, you have companies like Microsoft, Google, and also Huawei. All right, and so I mean, like they're sort of rubbing elbows on the same sort of global councils through these global governance institutions such as UNESCO.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing.
And this sort of
Super
illustrates,
dangerous.
the whole paradigm that Sutton pointed out, which is this, depending on if you turn on Fox or CNN, right, it's either Russia's the bad guy or China's the bad guy, except that, right, at the end of the day, right, there's a lot more overlap in terms of, international finance and multinational corporations across these so-called political divides than there is, sort of competition, the way that it's projected in the media.
Yeah, it's amazing. John, we're at the 60-minute mark. Great discussion. Thanks for coming on. Where's the best, is there anything you'd like to add or anything I missed before we wrap this up?
No, I think that was good. I like that. We covered a lot. Yeah.
And then where's the best place to get this book, School World Order? I
think it's currently sold out from Trying Day. So that's typically the best place to get it is directly from Chris Milligan, right? Instead of feeding Amazon. But last I checked, I think it's sold out at Chris's. I think he's having some supply chain issues. I think you can still get a copy of it at Amazon. So you could try either one. Either one's cool with me. I mean, one of the only good things about Amazon is that I get a sense of what it's doing. It sort of lets you know if it's selling. But those are the two best places that I can think of. And then the best place to reach out to you is your website, which is schoolworldorder.info, right? Yes, sir. Yeah. And there's a link to Trying Day there. Again, my database is there. All my articles are there. Most of my interviews, I'm very slow at updating my website. And, if you just want to send me an email, I'm always happy to interact with people and answer any questions. If I take a day or two, sometimes, as I mentioned, I'm an adjunct. So I work 3 jobs in addition to doing the book. And so, if it takes me a little while, please forgive me, but I never don't respond. I always get back to you. Right on. And thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. Again, the author's name is John Klyczek, and the book title is School World Order, the Technocratic Globalization of Corporatized Education. Thanks so much. Thank you. All right, stay there.